Chapter 1. The Sprout Children. It was July, in Hertford on the outskirts of London. A muggy mist hung over everything, making the town feel like the inside of a steamer. A sudden rustle and a bang inside the haze, and a woman in her 50s wearing a patched, pointed hat hurried out. Any Hogwarts student who saw her would have been surprised. Professor Pomona Sprout, Hufflepuff's beloved dean, normally calm and gentle as the soil she tended, was unusually agitated. "Robin, my poor brother," she muttered. "If Dumbledore hadn't told me that the Book of Admittance had written down a name, Ciel Sprout, I would have thought the whole family had been wiped out by Death Eaters. By Merlin, Ciel, that child, the Sprout line, he's still alive." She panted, guilt and remorse in her eyes. For years she had assumed there was no chance a child could have survived. As his only living relative, she felt she had failed him. Then resolve hardened her features. She would bring him back to the magical world and do everything in her power to make up for the lost years. She hurried toward an address on a slip of paper. Lister Plantation. This was the location the book had recorded. Professor Sprout waved her wand. The thin mist in front of her seemed to be seized by an invisible hand and parted. Beyond it stood a slight figure. At once, a kinship struck her. Yet as she watched what the child, Ciel Sprout, was doing, her face went pale and a wave of self-reproach washed over her. "80!" someone called. "80!" replied the child. At Lister Plantation, Ciel swung a shovel in the heavy, humid air. He dug carefully, each scoop bringing more earth into the neat pit he was forming. The heat did not faze him. He was focused and methodical. When the hole was ready, he planted a cotton seedling, and, for the first time that day, a small, private smile crossed his face. Only he could see the tiny line of text that flickered over the new seedling. "Successfully planted cotton X1. A faint globe of light bloomed on the plant. Planting reward, extremely weak increase in heat resistance, developing. When the plant matures, the reward will upgrade to weak increase in heat resistance, extremely weak increase in drought resistance." Ciel looked down the rows of young cotton, his eyes bright with expectation. "Once this batch matures and I harvest the last crop," he thought, "my heat and drought resistance will probably be good enough to plant trees in the Sahara without breaking a sweat." Ciel had been transmigrated. In his former life, he had been an agricultural graduate student working on experimental crops in a remote mountain valley. A landslide in a storm killed him there, and when he came to consciousness, he was in London in the 1980s, an orphan with the memories of his past life intact. Using planting techniques far ahead of the era, he had managed to eke out a living on farms. The first time he planted something himself, he had noticed text and little lights appearing on the plants. At first, he thought he was hallucinating. When he reached out and touched one of the lights and actually received a benefit, he realized he had a new power. He called it the planting system. As long as Ciel personally planted a plant and provided suitable conditions, he would receive a related reward. If he waited until the plant matured before claiming it, the reward would be much better. It wasn't the sort of all-powerful system that simply handed out stat multipliers, but it was perfect for someone who loved plants. The more he planted, the more he reaped. Other people might find planting, growing, and waiting dull, but to Ciel, an ex-agricultural student, it was a dream. In his old life, a new crop didn't mean guaranteed success. Storms, hail, or some nosy neighbor could ruin everything. The planting system removed some of that misery. Remembering his old frustrations, he shivered, then picked up his shovel again. "That was close," he told himself, trying for a light tone. "Let's plant another cotton to calm my nerves." He also thought of Mr. Lister, the plantation owner. "He's a good man," Ciel told himself. "He's willing to risk breaking the Child Protection Act to let me farm these fields for rewards, and he pays me wages. Without him, I couldn't have built up these benefits so quickly. Life is comfortable." Ciel swung and planted without pause. The sight of the industrious child tugged at Professor Sprout like a knife. She had feared at worst that her nephew had been placed in an orphanage. She had never imagined that in 1991, a boy of 11 would be working like a bonded laborer on a cotton plantation. Worse, he hadn't even had a sip of water while she watched. Professor Sprout drew her wand and fixed Mr. Lister with a look he did not forget. "Monster," she hissed. Even vampires are more merciful than you." Mr. Lister went pale and broke into a sweat. Before he could explain, a well-aimed stupefy from Professor Sprout knocked him unconscious. For a heartbeat, she wanted to use a cruciatus. Instead, she took a calming breath. First things first, get Shia out of here. She strode into the rows of cotton. Shia glanced up, puzzled. "Madam, are you?" Professor Sprout's cheeks flushed with an emotion he could not read. "Shia," she said simply. "From today on, you do not have to work in this plantation anymore." Shia's spirits dropped like a stone. Bad news. He hadn't studied economics, but he knew when someone told him he couldn't work any longer, it meant trouble. He had almost half a crop to go. His whole plan depended on these fields. If she was taking his job, he looked at her with a stubborn, practical calm. Thanks to his accumulated planting rewards, he could already survive conditions that would break an ordinary child. He needed less water and food. Sunlight refreshed him. His sleep needs were greatly reduced. Otherwise, he could never have managed so much alone. "Madam," he said, meeting her gaze, "if you mean to take my job, you should think again. I don't need wages, I don't need to eat or drink, and I barely sleep. Can you do that?" Professor Sprout froze. Only then did she react. Had Shiar thought she was trying to take his place in the greenhouses? Her heart ached at the certainty with which he'd made his conditions. What kind of life had this child led, to value a plot of land in a greenhouse so highly? After a long pause, Professor Sprout told Shiar everything she knew. It was Shiar's turn to be stunned. He had assumed he'd transmigrated into some parallel world, but only now did he understand he'd actually been reborn into the Harry Potter world. Hufflepuff had not been described much in the books, but he knew Professor Sprout as the herbology professor. He had never expected to be her nephew. Professor Sprout looked emotional as she spoke. "Shiar, Death Eaters attacked your family." She swallowed. "Your whole house was blown to dust. I thought you were dead." Her hands trembled. "But mercy above, you had a magic surge yesterday. The Book of Admittance recorded your name. That's how I knew you were still alive." "Magic surge?" Shiar echoed. Then his memory snapped into place. After he'd received the planting system, he had been testing its functions. Over the years, he'd learned a pattern. Rewards for planting varied. The harder a plant was to cultivate, the better the reward. Some plants even granted special bonuses. That's why, in addition to ordinary crops, he'd been gathering rare seeds and trying to grow them. Just yesterday, a handful of seeds he'd planted a year before had finally sprouted. On the system interface, it had read, 3 Margaret planted, but the reward cluster that appeared was unlike anything he'd seen. Missing necessary information, unable to read reward content. Curiosity had made him harvest one of the Margaret plants before it was fully mature. At the time, he had felt nothing but a slight breeze, and then stillness. Could that breeze have been a magic surge? The reward for planting Margaret had clearly been related to magic, and without the right concept, he'd been unable to read it. Shiar led Professor Sprout to a corner of the greenhouses where he kept the odd plants he experimented on. He pointed to the small Margaret sprouts and asked, "Auntie, you teach herbology at Hogwarts. Can you identify this plant? I raised it from a seed I found." Hearing him call her auntie filled Professor Sprout with joy. This child bore the Sprout blood. He hadn't resented her for years of absence. He accepted her as family. She peered at the seedlings, astonishment spreading across her face. "This is a flower in the magical world called Margaret," she said. "It's ornamental, but more importantly, it's used in potions to stabilize the magic of young wizards whose powers are going out of control. It's a magical herb. In the Muggle world, it barely survives." "You managed to cultivate it," she breathed, admiration plain in her voice. "As I suspected, the Sprout family's herbology talent runs in you, a successor at last." At that moment, the full reward information unlocked in Shiar's mind. Margaret planting reward, extremely weak magic enhancement, in gestation. After Margaret matures, the reward will upgrade to weak magic enhancement. Everything clicked. The body he'd come into was Professor Sprout's nephew. He was the same age as Harry Potter and would have been in the same year at Hogwarts. But there had been no such character in the original story because the original Shiar Sprout had no magical talent. He hadn't been recorded in the Book of Admittance and had never received a Hogwarts letter. By activating the marginal, even with an extremely weak magic enhancement, Xia'er had altered the original timeline. He'd opened a page that hadn't existed before. Xia'er Sprout, once cut off from the magical world, had been given the right to enter Hogwarts. He felt a rush of excitement. Who didn't dream of an owl delivering a parchment and the gates to that extraordinary world swinging open? And with his planting system, the magical world's abundance of plants was a perfect match. How many new crops could he cultivate there? Professor Sprout looked at him tenderly and asked, voice cautious, Xia'er, will you let me take care of you? Xia'er met her hopeful gaze and felt his heart soften. He nodded. Of course, Auntie. Her face split into a delighted grin. Anything you ask, I will do. Whatever you want. If you even asked for a dragon, I'd see to getting the ministry's permits. She said it half-jokingly, but her determination was clear. Despite her patched robes and modest appearance, she was head of Hufflepuff and one of the wizarding world's foremost herbologists. Her connections ran deep. Xia'er surprised her by shaking his head. No dragons. I want a plot of land to plant trees and flowers. And if you could give me some strange plant seeds from time to time, that would be wonderful. Professor Sprout's astonishment melted into affection. You can have as much land as you want. I'll guide you myself. She regarded him like a proud parent, eyes almost overflowing. Then she reached into a pocket and pulled out a thick, stampless envelope sealed with the crests of lion, badger, eagle, and snake. I nearly forgot, she said, handing it to him. This is your Hogwarts acceptance letter. It would normally be delivered by owl, but I couldn't wait. Welcome back to the magical world, Xia'er. 3. Legendary abilities. Xia'er stared at the envelope in his hand, the Hogwarts crest stamped on it, and felt a swell of emotion when Professor Sprout congratulated him. The magical world, he had fantasized about it for years in his previous life. The Philosopher's Stone, transmuting elements and granting immortality. A 1,000-year-old basilisk that could kill with a glance. The Triwizard Tournament, where young wizards battled dragons and Lord Voldemort awaited as the final challenge. Just thinking about it, dangerous, too damn dangerous. Shire's face hardened with resolve. Remember, he muttered to himself, I'm going to Hogwarts for only one thing. Planting trees, and more planting. What Philosopher's Stone? What basilisk? What Triwizard Tournament? What do any of them have to do with me? At the thought of planting trees, relief washed over him. Nothing in this world made Shire as calm and happy as planting. If he planted diligently, he could keep improving. What else in the world was such a deal? Let the hero Harry Potter and his friends handle the adventures. Professor Sprout smiled and said, If you're ready, Shire, I'll take you on a tour of the magical world first. I've sorted your textbooks and cauldrons, but you'll need to know where to buy them. And most importantly, your wand. That needs your personal presence. Come, take my hand. Shire's eyes lit up. The sights of the magical world were about to unfold. Mandrakes, devil's snare, biting cabbages, the humping willow. The thought of planting them thrilled him. As for the wand, Professor Sprout emphasized, he was curious, but he'd already prepared himself mentally. This body had originally been a squib. By rights, he shouldn't qualify for Hogwarts. It was only the rewards from planting Margaret flowers that had got him the acceptance letter. If aptitude could be graded, Harry Potter, with a fragment of Voldemort's soul, would be legendary. Shire, by contrast, expected to rank near the bottom. According to Ollivander's idea that the wand chooses the wizard, what special wands would even glance his way? He dared not dream of holly and phoenix feather, of elder and thestral hair, or of mithril wands and ancient fan-fiction relics. Still, Shire didn't care that much. The specialness, he believed, belonged to the wizard, not the wand. He took Professor Sprout's calloused hand. There was a loud pop and a dizzying rush, like being flushed down a toilet. When it cleared, the familiar sign of the leaky cauldron swung into view. Professor Sprout was already rummaging in a bag. It's normal to feel queasy after your first apparition, she said. Here, use this bag. Then she looked at him in surprise. Shire, aren't you uncomfortable? Shire blinked, then glanced at his planting system panel floating in his mind. Current abilities, photosynthesis, legendary. Lodging resistance, legendary. Vitality enhancement, legendary. Strength enhancement, legendary. Body reinforcement, legendary. Heat resistance, epic. drought resistance, diamond, magic, bronze. He skimmed past the lowest-rated bronze magic. Seeing all those legendary abilities, he began to understand. The rewards from the planting system had affected his magic indirectly. Legendary lodging resistance, for example, made him immune to the dizzy feeling of apparition, maybe even offered strong resistance to stupefy. Abilities like vitality enhancement and strength enhancement would certainly help against magical effects. His worries about years of farming being useless in the face of magic vanished. Farming hadn't been wasted after all. Shire gave Professor Sprout an embarrassed smile. "Yes, Auntie, I feel fine. No discomfort. Maybe it's because I exercise regularly." Professor Sprout returned an approving look. As expected of one of our sprouts, what a sturdy constitution. She led him through the leaky cauldron and showed him how to get into Diagon Alley. Count 3 bricks up from the dustbin, then 2 bricks across. Tap 3 times with your wand. She handed him her wand encouragingly. "You try." Shire paused. "Auntie, does it have to be tapped with a wand?" "Sometimes a wizard might be out for a stroll and not want to carry a wand," Sprout said. "Does that mean they can't get in?" "I don't think so. Anything handy will do. It's just that for wizards, a wand is usually the most convenient." Shire brightened as he understood. He pulled a mini shovel from his jacket pocket with a metallic clink. Clang, clang, clang. He tapped the bricks 3 times with the shovel. A wide archway formed slowly in the wall. Shire watched, delighted. "It really works." Professor Sprout's expression changed from mild amusement to baffled curiosity as her eyes landed on the shovel. "Shire, you carry a shovel with you?" He nodded, matter-of-factly. "Yes. What if I go out and want to plant a tree but don't have tools? That would be terrible. I was hoping for some magic to let me carry a multifunction entrenching tool. If possible, a tractor would be better. Then I could farm wherever I go." Sprout was equal parts amused and exasperated. Why did this child have such an obsession with farming? He truly was a chosen Hufflepuff. Still, she tried to be practical. For wizards, a wand can do almost anything, including that muggle thing you mentioned. A tractor? No, a charm spell is far more useful. Let's go pick out a wand that suits you. 4. An ash wand. You call that mediocrity? Professor Sprout led Shia Sprout through the archway and straight into the bustle of Diagon Alley. Even though Shia had seen it in films in his previous life, the real thing still overwhelmed him. Diagon Alley was far more impressive in person. Ollivander's wand shop, by contrast, looked plain and unassuming, but anyone visiting for the first time would hardly be focused on the shop's facade. No sooner had Professor Sprout guided him inside than Ollivander appeared from behind the counter, eyes widening in surprise. "Professor Sprout? Bringing a first year this year?" he asked. "I thought Professor McGonagall handled that." Professor Sprout smiled and introduced Shia as if presenting a treasure. "This is my nephew, Shia Sprout. He was lost in the Muggle world for many years. I found him in the Muggle world," Shia added. "He's here to be fitted for a wand." Professor Sprout finished. Ollivander blinked. The Sprout family might not be one of the great houses, and it had suffered at the hands of Death Eaters during the Second Wizarding War. Only Professor Sprout remained prominent, but she was the Hufflepuff head of house and a renowned herbologist, quiet but respected. Another Sprout heir was news to celebrate. "Then I truly congratulate you, Professor Sprout," he said sincerely, turning to Shia with renewed interest. "Child, having inherited the Sprout name, you will surely be a remarkable wizard. Perhaps, like your aunt, you might become a master of herbology." Shia smiled faintly. He wasn't sure whether Ollivander offered similar encouragement to every child who came into his shop, but it made sense. Wands were expensive. In the original stories, Ron Weasley couldn't afford a new wand. His was damaged and patched for years until his family won a prize from the Daily Prophet. Buying a wand was a major, sometimes emotional purchase. Ollivander's reassurances were part of the ritual. Ollivander measured Shia height, arm span, and posture as he lectured about the old truth. Wands choose the wizard. Shia listened politely, nodding now and then, but inside he felt nothing. The idea of a wand having a personality didn't appeal to him. If anything, he distrusted tools with strong wills. To him, stability and dependability came first. A tool that imposed its own temperament could be more trouble than it was worth. He watched as Ollivander waved one wand after another. Each produced little or no reaction. The more indifferent the wands were, the stranger Ollivander's expression grew. He had handled so many apprentices over the years that beneath his florid talk, he could usually tell something about a child's prospects by how a wand responded. Ciel's reactions were almost the worst he'd seen in a candidate, only slightly above a squib. He must barely meet Hogwarts admission requirements. Ciel had expected this outcome. Calmly, he interrupted, "Mr. Ollivander, you always say wands choose their masters. These seem not very keen on me. May I describe what I need instead?" Ollivander frowned. He prided himself on the mystique of his craft and would rarely do anything that might tarnish it. But Ciel's lack of response was a problem. Professor Sprout could be embarrassed if the fitting went badly. He relented. "Mr. Ciel Sprout, you are a very particular customer then. Please, tell me your needs." "Reliable performance," Ciel said simply. "Stability. I do heavy work. Whatever I use must have a good temper and be hard-working. Choose a wand with those qualities." Ollivander stared. Most young wizards wanted something flashy, something to hint at greatness. A request for practicality and endurance was new to him. Still, the requirement was not impossible. He selected a plain, unadorned wand and placed it in Ciel's hand. Ciel gave it a gentle flick. No sparks, no fireworks, only a solid, steady sensation of craftsmanship. Ollivander relaxed. "This will do," he murmured. 12 inches, ash with unicorn tail hair. Both core and wood are known for stability and resilience. Together, they suggest that the wizard who wields it. He stopped mid-sentence, an odd look crossing his face. Professor Sprout's smile faded into concern. "What do you mean, together they suggest?" she asked. They left the shop, with Ollivander's voice following them down the alley. "Professor Sprout, Mr. Ciel Sprout, this wand is on the house." Ciel offered a small smile. "Aunt, don't look so gloomy. It's free. Think of the money you've saved." Professor Sprout could only stare. "You can smile about that? After a line like that, either as ordinary as dust or as brilliant as a morning star, what does he mean? 100 million grains of dust might not produce a single morning star." She ground her teeth. "That Ollivander, I'm tempted to hurl a basket of biting cabbages through his window." She paused, worry replacing irritation. Perhaps Ollivander had dashed Ciel's hopes. But Ciel seemed unconcerned. "If Mr. Ollivander can predict 10 or 20 years into the future," he said with a hint of dry humor, "he shouldn't be running a wand shop. He should be a prophet." Professor Sprout laughed despite herself. "All right, no more talk of prophecies," she said, deciding to change the subject. "Since you have your wand, let's enjoy Diagon Alley. There's a marvelous ice cream shop nearby." Ciel checked his watch and shook his head. "No, I have important things to do." Professor Sprout raised an eyebrow. He answered earnestly, "Farming. I need to plant 3 acres of cotton today. I've made a plan. I must finish it." Before she could fully protest, Ciel set off, pulling Professor Sprout along. She watched his determined face, his near-obsessive love of planting, and found her worries melting away. Talent could take many forms. She had heard herself described as ordinary, weighed down by modesty, but she was the Hufflepuff head of house and a master of herbology. Sometimes endurance and a willingness to get your hands dirty were the truest marks of ability. She smiled, feeling an old, fierce pride. "Either as ordinary as dust or as brilliant as a morning star," she repeated under her breath. "Just wait and see. Ciel Sprout will be a morning star." At Lister Plantation, Cheryl looked up at Professor Sprout. "Auntie, I still have 3 acres of cotton to plant," she said. "That will take a long time," Cheryl replied. "It's hot and stuffy here, and you must be very busy. Why don't you get back to your work and come pick me up tomorrow, or give me an address and I'll go by myself." Professor Sprout's face softened with a gentle, affectionate smile. She firmly shook her head. "That won't do. Cheryl, I can't let you out of my sight again." "Don't worry," she added. "School hasn't started yet. I have plenty of time. Besides, I'm a herbology master. You wouldn't believe how harsh some magical plants' growing conditions are. This little stuffiness is nothing to me." Cheryl nodded and stopped insisting. He went to gather his digging tools, but Professor Sprout's smile grew a little mischievous. "Cheryl, even though you haven't enrolled yet, you already have your own wand. You should get used to casting with it. It's much more convenient than Muggle tools." She drew her wand, pointed the tip at the ground, traced a spiral outward from the center, and with a small flick of her wrist intoned, Terra, Laxus. A yellow-brown light burst from the wand tip and disappeared into the patch of earth before them. Cheryl watched, astonished, as the soil seemed to turn itself over. Pebbles were pushed out, compacted clods softened. In an instant, the dirt became the perfect friable loam any farmer would dream of. If I'd had to do that with a shovel, Cheryl murmured. This is magic. Professor Sprout couldn't hide a touch of pride. She was modest by nature, but before Cheryl, the only bloodline heir of the Sprout family, she allowed herself to show it. A tractor needs fuel, Cheryl joked, eyes wide. You just need to eat. If you were here full-time, we could take every farm in London. Professor Sprout smiled, half amused, half exasperated. Cheryl's obsession with planting never ceased to astonish her. Then she looked at him encouragingly. This soil-loosening charm is simple. Want to try? Cheryl nodded eagerly. Mimicking her exact movements, he raised his ashwood wand and said, Terra Laxus! Professor Sprout beamed at his fluid motion and precise incantation. For a first attempt at wand work, his form was excellent, and that showed Cheryl's quick learning ability. But the light from Cheryl's wand was paler, and the result only loosened the surface layer of soil. Compared to Professor Sprout's effortless work, the difference was obvious. She suppressed a brief sigh. Cheryl's movements and words were perfect. The only flaw was his magic power. Ollivander had been right. Cheryl's raw magical strength was weaker than a typical young wizard's, which made his charms less potent. Tougher spells would take him longer to learn. Still, she pushed her disappointment aside when she saw Cheryl's easy smile. My magic is weaker than a normal young wizard's, he admitted candidly. Charms come out a bit weaker, but it's still better than a shovel, right? I'll do my best. He did. Cheryl cast the soil-loosening charm again and again, then turned the softened earth with a shovel, dug planting holes, and set in cotton seedlings. In no time, a baby cotton plant was in the ground. Successfully planted cotton X1. Reward claimable, extremely slight increase in heat resistance, in gestation. After the cotton matures, this reward will be upgraded to slight increase in heat resistance, extremely slight increase in drought resistance. A cluster of light orbited the seedling. Cheryl's grin widened. Using the charm made planting far more efficient than manual labor, at least 3 times faster. He also noticed something else. The reward light around this seedling seemed larger than usual. The perfect soil had clearly improved the planting quality, and with it, the reward. If perfect soil at the loosening stage could make a noticeable difference, Cheryl thought, then doing every step perfectly across many acres would multiply the benefit. One plant's small gain could become enormous on a large scale. Fueled by that thought, Cheryl worked almost without pause. He kept up a relentless rhythm of casting and planting. In this world, magic needed power to work, but did not consume an expendable magic pool. The spells required force to sustain, but did not deplete an internal mana bar. In other words, an infinite mana supply, limited only by the caster's physical stamina. Years of farming had given Cheryl exceptional endurance. He could work longer than most. Professor Sprout watched, increasingly astonished. She herself couldn't sustain spellcasting at such a pace. Cheryl's vigor made her wonder about his heritage. Did he perhaps have giant blood after all? By the end of the day, Cheryl hadn't just finished the 3 acres he'd planned. He'd planted an extra 4, totaling 7 acres. If Professor Sprout hadn't insisted he stop to rest, he said he might have worked through the night. Planting by magic exhilarated him. That's enough for today, Professor Sprout said at last. Come back to the Sprout family home with me. Get a good 2 days rest. We have a greenhouse there. You can see many magical plants. Cheryl brightened at the mention of the family greenhouse, and, despite wanting to continue, agreed. He packed his things, carefully taking the 3 Margaret plants that had already grown. He jogged past the rows he'd planted, as if saying goodbye to them, and waved at the plantation as he left. Professor Sprout watched him go with a relieved smile. So passionate about plants, she murmured. Even if he never becomes powerful at magic, in herbology, he already has the makings of a master. Unseen by her, Cheryl had claimed all the unclaimed rewards for the 7 acres he had just planted. Light orbs swirled around him as the system updated. Heat resistance upgraded from epic to legendary. Drought resistance upgraded from diamond to epic. Cheryl walked out of the plantation, waved his sleeve, and left the Muggle world behind. The life of the magical world was beginning. 6. Greenhouse, growing marguerite. The Sprout family home sat tucked into a peaceful, flower-filled valley, its exterior cloaked in vines and creepers so it blended almost seamlessly with the landscape. Chard breathed out in admiration. What a magnificent house! Professor Sprout's face held a trace of joy beneath a deeper sorrow. Your father and I grew up here. After the accident, I was the only one left in the family, so I rarely came back. Her voice tightened. Chard's expression shifted to surprise. Aunt, how did my parents die? Professor Sprout clenched her fist, hatred and grief etched into her features. Anton Dolohov, cold-blooded, merciless. He slaughtered so many witches and wizards who dared resist you-know-who and the Death Eaters during the war. The Prewett brothers were upright and brave. Dolohov killed them with the killing curse. The Longbottoms were strong, but he and his people drove them to madness. And, your parents, they were killed by his charms. Tears rose in her eyes. Such a murderer, he belongs in Azkaban forever. Chard committed the name to memory. He remembered that, in the original accounts of the war, there would later be a mass breakout from Azkaban. Dolohov might escape then. Maybe he could do something about it someday, he thought. But first he had to become stronger. To do that, he needed to grow more plants. Professor Sprout shook herself out of the memory and wiped her eyes. Let's not dwell on sad things. Chard, this is your first day back at the Sprout family home. Come, let me show you around. Which part would you like to see first? She laughed softly after a moment. Knowing you, you'll want to see the greenhouse. All right, let's start there. They walked through an old hall and down a long vine-covered corridor where speckled light fell through the leaves. When they opened a heavy door, a vast greenhouse spread out before them. Professor Sprout's voice softened with nostalgia. This is the Sprout family greenhouse, maintained for generations. Herbology is our family tradition. The greenhouse and our herbology knowledge are the family's most precious heritage. Then she looked at him directly. Now, this greenhouse belongs to you. Chard was stunned. Even without knowing exact prices in the magical world, he knew such a greenhouse would be invaluable. In the Muggle world, it would have been expensive. Here, with its history and magic, it must be worth a fortune. He started to refuse, but Professor Sprout continued. I already have a greenhouse at Hogwarts, probably the best greenhouse in the entire magical world. I haven't been able to tend to this one for a long time. It's a shame to leave it empty. You're the only remaining direct Sprout besides me. If the family treasures aren't given to you, who else could they go to? Chard thought for a moment, then nodded. He needed this greenhouse. Thank you, Aunt. Professor Sprout relaxed into a relieved smile. Good. Let me show you around. She began to explain the greenhouse's features. It's under an undetectable extension charm, so the interior is more than 10 times larger than it appears from the outside. There are also charms to regulate temperature and humidity in different sections. One end can be freezing, the other as hot as the inside of a volcano. The key, though, is the soil. The Sprouts have treated this soil with fertilizing potions for generations. Over time, it's become rich with magic. Most magical herbs have higher survival rates here. Their effects are stronger when they mature, and sometimes even the maturation time is shortened. Chard listened, eyes wide with wonder. For a herbology master, this greenhouse was the equivalent of a top-tier laboratory. If he'd had it earlier in life, his abilities might already be far beyond where they were. He straightened and spoke earnestly. Aunt, I'll make good use of this greenhouse. I won't tarnish the Sprout name. Professor Sprout's face lit up. I know you won't. Now let me teach you how to operate it. She demonstrated the controls. Everything was surprisingly simple. A few wand motions, and, because of the family enchantments, those of Sprout blood could easily command it. Chard, who in his previous life had handled complicated laboratory equipment, picked it up instantly. He'd learned everything after watching Professor Sprout operate it once. She watched him with evident appreciation, pleased that the family had a successor. Chard, are you tired? Do you want to eat and rest? Having just been given this big toy, Chard didn't want to stop. Professor Sprout smiled. All right, it seems you can't wait. Then I'll guide you in cultivating your first magical herb. Is there a particular herb you want to grow? Chard's eyes brightened. With Professor Sprout, an expert, guiding him, his cultivation might be as close to perfect as possible, and the more perfectly he cultivated, the greater the reward. His gaze fell on the 3 margarites he had brought with him, the rewards that had made his magic surge and brought him into this world. His magic was still too weak. Growing more margarite would increase it. He was also curious about their cultivation needs. He looked at Professor Sprout and said, "Aunt, I'll start with margarite." She nodded. Very well. Margarite is a magical herb, but it's not too difficult to grow. It doesn't need special potions for watering. The tricky part is its love of high temperatures and heavy, stuffy heat. Crucially, it also needs to sense positive emotions. The cultivator must endure the heat and be cheerful, spend time with the plants and remain happy. The hotter and more stagnant the air, and the happier the emotions they perceive, the faster they mature. Suddenly, everything made sense. No wonder the margarites hadn't thrived when London was cold and damp. They only survived once the weather turned hot and oppressive. And Chard tended to be happy working in gardens. Maybe that had helped them. Determined, he thought of his own resistances. In his previous life, he'd pushed his heat resistance to legendary and his drought resistance to epic. The stifling heat that would flatten others felt like a cool breeze to him. With his help, margarites would flourish. There was time before school started. He would fill the greenhouse with them and make his magic surge even more once they matured. Professor Sprout produced a large sack of margarite seeds and demonstrated the key steps. Under her guidance, Chard planted one himself. The system immediately notified him, "You have successfully planted a margarite." Reward: extremely weak increase in magic, developing. After the margarite matures, the reward will upgrade to weak increase in magic. Chard watched the glowing orb above the new plant. It was a full circle larger than when he had planted before. Though the system's description of the reward hadn't changed much, the actual harvest reward would be at least 30% greater. Outside the greenhouse, an owl's wings beat against the air. A letter arrived for Professor Sprout. Her expression shifted. "A letter from Dumbledore? He says he has something important to discuss with me." "You should go," Chard said. "I'll stay here at the family home. Don't worry on my account." Professor Sprout nodded. She hugged him, warned him not to overexert himself, and left for Hogwarts. Once she was gone, Chard inhaled deeply. The greenhouse was already warm, like the humid heat that Margaret preferred, but it was only the minimum. For a plant like this, it wasn't enough. For someone with legendary heat resistance, the current temperature felt pleasantly cool. Earlier, Professor Sprout had gently forbidden him to crank the heat, thinking of his comfort, but now she wasn't here. He could try pushing it. He waved his wand. The temperature dial on the control panel began to turn. The air grew thicker and hotter. An ordinary person would begin to feel faint, but Chard felt nothing. He watched the reward glow around the margarite swell, then breathed and raised his wand again. Temperature, full blast. Chapter 7, Professor Sprout's Shocking Perfect Quality. After cranking the greenhouse's temperature all the way up, the air shimmered and distorted from the heat. The whole place felt like it had been sealed inside a steaming oven. Wisps of steam rose from the soil. Few people could have endured such an atmosphere for long. Even wizards would need protective spells or tools. Ciel, however, looked unchanged, only slightly stuffy, like someone waiting out the sultry calm before a summer thunderstorm. Uncomfortable, yes, but completely bearable. With his legendary vitality, he could have stayed in the greenhouse forever if he wanted. What caught his eye was the reward orb above the margaret he had planted earlier. It was noticeably larger after the temperature increase. Joy brightened his face. Since Professor Sprout rarely came to the estate and usually only checked in occasionally, most of the greenhouse lay empty. If he could fill it all with Margaret and let them mature together, the rewards, he could already picture it, and the idea made the stifling heat worth it. Ignoring his slight discomfort, Ciel kept casting the soil loosening charm and planting the seeds Professor Sprout had left behind. Perfectly planting a Margaret took care and patience. Every small detail mattered. Xia'er had grown used to tedious, meticulous work from his previous life, and now, each time he planted one, a cluster of reward lights shimmered above the plant like a tiny accolade, a simple pleasure he treasured. Time slipped by minute after minute as he moved from the entrance furrows deeper into the beds, tending row after neat row of tiny pits and the plants that grew in them. Late that night, Professor Pomona Sprout hurried through the corridors of Hogwarts with Dumbledore's words still turning in her head. The Savior, Harry Potter, will be enrolling this year. Dumbledore has prepared a set of challenges to train Harry. He hopes I can be responsible for one of the checkpoints. Pomona felt a flash of annoyance. He had called her in all that haste for this? More pressing on her mind, though, was the Sprout estate. My Xia'er is still alone in the big manor, she thought. Poor Xia'er must be hungry. As head of Hufflepuff, she had the small privilege of ordering the house elves to prepare several nourishing medicinal meals, and she hurried off to take them home. Dumbledore's request could wait. Children's training games were hardly urgent compared to her little family. In his office, Dumbledore learned from the portraits that Professor Sprout had set off for her estate with food for Xia'er and felt a flicker of envy and loneliness. That child, Xia'er Sprout, he murmured, he truly makes Pomona happy. He sighed, somewhat melancholic. He was glad the Sprouts had a blood heir, but he had already heard what had happened at Ollivander's. Xia'er's magical aptitude was, sadly, lacking. Dumbledore had hoped Xia'er and Harry might become good friends, but with Xia'er's gifts, such as they were, he would be unsuited to dangerous training. Better that the child have an ordinary, happy school life. With that decided, Dumbledore set the matter aside and returned his full attention to preparing the Savior. Pomona had already reached the Sprout family estate when she called out at the door. "Xia'er, I'm back. Are you hungry? I brought medicinal meals from the Hufflepuff kitchens. I'm not boasting. The food in Hufflepuff is the best in the whole wizarding world." But the house was lit and empty. Her heart tightened. Could Xia'er still be in the greenhouse? She quickened her pace and hurried out to the glass structure. Even before she touched the handle, heat rolled out at her in a wave. How high had he set the temperature? Xia'er was still inside. He had no spells to shield him from such heat. He could pass out in minutes. A longer delay could be fatal. Panic gripped her, and she nearly ran in. "Xia'er!" she shouted. The sight that met her, however, was not what she had imagined. Xia'er was lively, hopping around the beds, planting another Margaret before he turned toward her with a small smile. "Aunt," he called. Pomona's face went white. Her relief poured into a scolding roar that nearly cracked the glass. "Xia'er, who told you to crank the temperature up so high? Do you know how frightened I was? You're my only family in this world. If anything had happened to you, how would I have explained it to your parents?" Xia'er's smile faltered. He blinked, startled, then rushed out a guilty apology. "I'm sorry, Aunt. I didn't mean to make you worry." Pomona waved her wand and fired off several anti-heat charms, cutting the suffocating warmth away from him. She checked him over carefully, and once convinced he was all right, let out a long, trembling breath. "Don't do that again. You can't scare your aunt like that." "Okay," Xia'er said earnestly. "Next time I crank the temperature, I'll tell you, Aunt. My constitution is very special. I really don't mind the heat." He brightened and asked, as if it were the most important thing, "Aunt, how do you like the Margaret I planted?" Pomona's exasperation softened into fond amusement. He had nearly given her a heart attack, and all he cared about were his plants. Then her gaze swept over the rows he'd tended. Something about them made her pause. She pulled out her wand and cast a detecting charm. Her expression changed from surprise to stunned delight. "The condition of these, Margaret, perfect," she whispered. She didn't say it aloud at first, but she understood what it meant. Margarets were common herbs, but one of this quality was extraordinarily rare. So rare that its properties could shift. Plants like these could be made into an ancient, seldom-seen potion whose effect was to enhance a wizard's magical ability. Pomona's hand tightened on her wand as she looked at Xia'er, planting with such care, the soft green of the seedlings catching the light. The implications of what she was seeing settled over her like a new and precious responsibility. Professor Sprout took a deep breath and looked at Xia'er. She did not hold back her praise. "This could grow Margarets of perfect quality," she said. "Ciel, you are an absolute genius in herbology." She wasn't exaggerating. Planting Margarets was deceptively simple, but their requirements were peculiar. They needed both a stifling environment and a genuinely happy cultivator at the moment of planting to reach perfect quality. Protective charms could keep most wizards physically comfortable in such an environment, but they would still find it unpleasant. And no potion could substitute for the kind of joy that had to come from the heart. How many people could willingly put themselves in such conditions and still be overjoyed? Even most herbology masters lacked that sort of masochistic cheerfulness. Ciel, however, was different, truly, unusually happy. That was why this batch of Margarets reached perfect condition immediately after being planted. If that state could be maintained, these Margarets would make talent-enhancing potions far superior to anything in the textbooks. Professor Sprout's mind raced. She knew the old recipe for the talent enhancement potion. History told of wizards of little innate ability becoming prodigies after drinking it. But its ingredients were exacting. The most basic required perfect quality Margarets, and the others were even rarer. It also demanded a top-tier potions master to brew it. Because of that, the potion had appeared only rarely. Now, though, she might have the key ingredient growing in her greenhouse. And as for a potions master, Severus Snape was certainly among the best. One ingredient down, she thought. Perhaps she could find the rest. If she succeeded, Ciel's talent could be improved. She did not tell Ciel any of this. The recipe was ancient and the other components uncertain. She would not give him hope she might have to take away. Better to wait until she had gathered everything. The dangers or difficulties of such a search mattered little to her. Ciel was her only family, and she would pay any price. Then she pulled Ciel out of the greenhouse. "I don't care what your previous habits were," she scolded lightly. "Here, Ciel, you must eat well and sleep well." Ciel could only nod. If she had not insisted, he might still have stayed up through the night in the greenhouse. Fortunately, Professor Sprout added that Margarets required the happiest emotions only at planting. Like laying a house's foundation, the start was what mattered most. Since Ciel had planted them with perfect joy, they did not need constant company. After a month, they would be fine with only daily pruning and maintenance, and they should be fully mature in about 6 months. 6 months, Ciel thought, eyes lighting up. That's fast. Professor Sprout placed a helping of restorative food from the Hufflepuff kitchen on his plate. "Balance is essential," she said. "Whether potions or herbology, you must learn to balance work and life. Now, try this. It's good." Ciel took a bite, and his admiration showed. He ate more quickly. "It's really good," he said. "Aunt, you haven't eaten yet, have you? You should eat too." They smiled at one another. In the long, empty Sprout manor, there was suddenly a little warmth. Time passed. Nearly 2 months slipped by, and the date arrived, September 1st, 1991, the day Hogwarts reopened. Early that morning, Professor Sprout went straight to the greenhouse. Ciel, as usual, was already busy in the humid air. "Ciel," she called, stopping him. "Today is school. You don't have to work so hard, you know." Ciel blinked. "School starts today?" He had filled the entire Sprout greenhouse with Margarets a month earlier and had tended them around the clock, watching the reward halos over the plants grow. Time had blurred for him. Without her reminder, he might have forgotten entirely. He waved his wand and traced a triangle in front of a bed of young Margarets, then flicked his wrist as if closing a pair of scissors. "Arbor Siccus!" He intoned deadwood removal. It was the pruning charm, only the second spell Professor Sprout had taught him after the soil loosening spell. It trimmed dead branches and excess leaves faster and more precisely than scissors. More important, the pruned wood and withered leaves did not go to waste. They turned instantly into ash and merged into the soil, feeding the plant. Pruning with Arbor Siccus made plants grow more luxuriantly and was a must-learn spell in herbology. As the dead material fell and dissolved into nutrients, the Margarets brightened and grew stronger. Professor Sprout watched with evident pride. "Your pruning charm is getting better and better," she said. Ciel grinned. "In 2 months, I haven't learned any other spells. From morning till night, I've been casting the soil loosening and the pruning charms. If I still can't do them well, I'd be unworthy of the name Sprout. Professor Sprout looked at him, satisfied. My dear Shiar, the name Sprout will shine through you. These Margarets have passed the initial stage. I'll take care of them from here. Don't delay your start at school. Shiar glanced back at the bed of Margarets, reluctant to leave. But the thought of Hogwarts, especially the greenhouse Professor Sprout had mentioned so many times, filled him with excitement. If the Sprout greenhouse was magical, how grand must Hogwarts be? In 4 months, he'd be able to harvest these plants. By then, his magic would be stronger, and maybe he could plant other magical species there. He packed his things efficiently. Professor Sprout watched, smiling expectantly. I wonder which house Shiar will be sorted into, she mused. If he isn't put in Hufflepuff, I'll throw the sorting hat into the fertilizer bin. She took his hand. Hold on tight. Let's go to King's Cross Station. Chapter 9, King's Cross Station, Chlorophytum Comosum. With a sharp bang, Shiar and Professor Sprout apparated outside King's Cross Station. The station was unusually crowded that day. In addition to ordinary travelers, there were families in odd, antiquated clothes, clearly witches and wizards, and a number of ministry officials milling about, all looking tense. Professor Sprout leaned closer to Shiar and explained, Opening day at Hogwarts is the most important day in the wizarding world. The ministry doesn't want any mishaps today. They've set a confundus charm so muggles will ignore anything out of the ordinary. She lowered her voice. I also heard something happened at Gringotts. Some brazen wizard actually broke into one of the vaults. That's why security is unusually tight at the station. Shiar felt a jolt of recognition. No wonder the Hogwarts Express left from King's Cross. He'd always thought it odd in his previous life that wizards used London's busiest station with all their trunks and owls. A single slip could violate the International Statute of Secrecy. Now it made sense. Ministry employees were keeping an eye on things. Hearing about the Gringotts break-in stirred his memories too. The old conflict between the so-called savior, Harry Potter, and Voldemort was still set to play out. For a moment, the weight of fate pressed on him. Then he pushed it aside. This wasn't his concern. He'd come to Hogwarts to ignore the outside world and focus on one thing, planting trees. As Professor Sprout was about to lead him toward platform 9 3/4, a white-haired woman approached, accompanied by a somewhat round-faced little boy. They greeted each other warmly. Professor Sprout introduced them. This is Miss Longbottom. This is Neville Longbottom. Our Sprout and Longbottom families are related, she added, smiling. Shiar, you're 2 months older than Neville, so consider yourself a distant cousin. Shiar blinked in surprise. The Sprout and Longbottom families were related. Of course, most wizarding families were tangled up in kinship somewhere, but it still felt strange to hear it so plainly. He quickly bowed and greeted Miss Longbottom and Neville. Neville, shy and nervous, managed a small "Thank you, Cousin Shiar." Miss Longbottom scolded him in a brisk, loving way. Neville, you're too timid. Hold your head up. You're a Longbottom, for goodness sake. Her admonishment only made Neville shrink further into himself. She sighed and turned to Shiar with a softer expression. I'm so glad you've returned to the Sprout family. You'll both be at Hogwarts together. Do keep an eye on Neville. He's forgetful. Shiar waved his hand. We'll look out for each other. Given our family's connection, that's only right. That seemed to please Miss Longbottom. After a few more words, they all hoisted their trunks and set off toward platform 9 3/4. The Hogwarts Express gleamed on the platform, its nameplate polished, and the area teemed with trunks. Trunks and more trunks. First years sobbed as parents said goodbye. Older students moved briskly about. Seeing the scene in person, Shiar couldn't help smiling. It was far more vivid than in films. Soon Miss Longbottom, having given Neville one last round of instructions, waved them aboard. Professor Sprout called to Shiar, If you need anything on the train, find the Hufflepuff prefect. We'll see you again at the sorting ceremony. Shiar lifted one of Neville's trunks with a casual motion. Neville stared in surprise. You're really strong. Thank you, Cousin Shiar. They found an empty compartment and settled in. On the platform, Sprout watched them go with a gentle expression. Miss Longbottom's face, however, wavered between hope and worry. I'm so worried about Neville, she confessed. He's so clumsy, he's easy to bully, And we even thought he might be a squib. What if he can't keep up with the lessons and gets expelled? I don't know what we'd do." Her voice faltered. Then she said, "I heard from Ollivander that Shia-Ur's magical ability isn't particularly strong." Professor Sprout snorted. "Ollivander's just reading wands, not destinies. If he could see a wizard's fate, he should apply to teach divination." Her eyes flashed with pride. "Just wait and see. He'll regret underestimating Shia-Ur. My Shia-Ur has the potential for greatness." Ms. Longbottom listened, surprised and moved. She wanted to proclaim that Neville, too, could be great, but she didn't have that certainty. "Well," she murmured, "I hope Neville can learn something from Shia-Ur." Meanwhile, back in the compartment, Shia-Ur didn't want to waste the time before departure. He took a few small pots from his suitcase and set them on the seat. Each pot held a tiny plant, bright green, shaped in a curl like a little goldfish, no larger than a fingernail. Neville peered at them with wide eyes. "What are those?" A small smile touched Shia-Ur's lips. "They're a rather special magical herb," he said. "Their name is the goldfish vine." 10. Magical perception. Hermione Granger. Goldfish vine? Neville repeated the unfamiliar name in confusion. "What is it for?" Cher explained. "It's an herb used in potions that affect memory. Many memory potions require goldfish vine." "Why does it do that?" Neville asked. "It's tied to how it grows," Cher said. "This magical herb isn't picky about soil, water, or sunlight. It's almost like a muggle succulent, but for it to thrive, it has to absorb people's forgetfulness." "Forgetfulness?" Neville echoed. Cher nodded. "Whenever someone forgets something near a goldfish vine, the plant takes in that forgetfulness as nutrients. The more it absorbs, the faster and healthier it grows." Neville's eyes widened. "There's such a plant? Merlin's beard, that's amazing." He peered at the little pots with growing interest. Then he blinked. "Cousin Cher, these goldfish vines seem to have gotten greener." Cher smiled. "That means they're absorbing the forgetfulness they need. Neville, have you forgotten something?" Neville stood frozen for a moment, thinking hard. "Forgotten something? I think I have. But what could it be?" While Neville racked his brain, Cher glanced at the faint inscriptions and reward-like clusters hovering above the goldfish vines. A small smile curved his lips as the messages appeared in his mind, like system prompts. "You have successfully planted goldfish vine." Reward: extremely weak increase in magic perception, incubating. After the goldfish vine matures, the reward will be upgraded to weak increase in magic perception. The tiny reward lights above the pots swelled slowly, evidence that the plants had taken in good nourishment. Cher felt a thrill of satisfaction. It worked. Neville is an excellent catalyst for cultivating goldfish vine. Cher thought back to the pots he'd planted a month earlier. They had barely grown. But with Neville nearby, they were flourishing. If he kept planting them where Neville spent time, they might mature very quickly. He had been debating which magical plant to try next. He'd been tempted to grow mandrake, devil's snare, venomous tentacula, or biting cabbage, powerful herbs that would surely bring generous rewards. Professor Sprout had warned him, though, the stronger the plant, the more precise the magic needed while planting. Even the slightest miscalibration could ruin the crop, sometimes wiping out every seed. Adjusting magic and potions to the plant's state, that was herbology's difficulty. Masters were rare because either they were born with extraordinary magic perception or they had spent years honing it. With Cher's current magic perception, even if he perfectly mimicked Professor Sprout's motions, it would be superficial. He didn't yet have the sensitivity to plant high-level magical herbs, so he had to choose something he could manage that would also help him. Goldfish vine fit perfectly. It rewarded increased magic perception. Plant enough of them first, let them mature, and Cher's own perception might improve enough to attempt more difficult plants. And Hufflepuffs, clumsy, often forgetful, would provide the ideal environment for goldfish vine to thrive. Neville alone had an abundance of forgetfulness to spare. Cher's anticipation showed in his eyes as he looked at the vines making steady progress. He pushed the pots toward Neville. "Neville," he said, "you seem very interested in magical plants. These goldfish vines can even tell you if you've forgotten something. I'm giving them to you." Neville hesitated and tried to refuse with a quick wave. "No, this is too precious." Cher wouldn't take no for an answer. He launched into a flurry of flattery and pleading, praise of Neville's hands, claims that Neville must be a natural at herbology, small joking insults to stir Neville's pride. Faced with that, Neville could only laugh and accept the pots, cheeks going pink. When he came to himself, his gratitude was plain. It was the first time since childhood that someone had shown such trust in him. "Cousin Cher, I'll take good care of them. I won't let you down." Cher smiled, satisfied. He hadn't really worried the plants would die in Neville's care. If anyone could kill Goldfish Vine, it would be Neville with his memory. But Cher suspected Neville might do something even more surprising. He might accidentally cultivate perfect quality vines. If that happened, Cher's progress toward planting higher-level herbs would accelerate even faster. As the departure time for the Hogwarts Express drew near, more students boarded and the compartments filled. The carriage where Cher and Neville sat filled up too. In bustled a young witch with bushy brown hair and slightly protruding front teeth, an otterish look that made her face immediately memorable. "Hello, my name is Hermione Granger," she said, sliding into the compartment. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" Her eyes landed on Neville's goldfish vines, and she gave a small gasp. "Is this goldfish vine? I read about it in 1,000 Magical Herbs and Fungi. You haven't even started Hogwarts, and you already have magical plants?" Longing showed openly in her expression. "May I take a closer look?" Cher went instantly on guard. Before Neville could answer, he cut in firmly. "No." Hermione's face fell with disappointment and a little alarm. Had she offended them? Cher, suddenly a little flustered, hurried on. "You look like a very clever person who never forgets anything, a top student. Please stay away from the goldfish vine. It prefers fools. Smart people are poisoned to it." 11. A true genius. First meeting. Malfoy Hermione had been crestfallen a moment before, but at Cher's nervous compliment, she brightened instantly. "Really? You think I'm clever? Well, it sounds like bragging. But all my previous teachers said so. I'm torn between Ravenclaw and Gryffindor. Ravenclaw suits the curious," she went on eagerly, "but Gryffindor is best of all." While Hermione chattered away, Neville's mood sank again. "Cousin," he muttered, "were you just saying I'm a fool?" Cher looked entirely calm. "Neville, look at your memory. I said you're an herbology prodigy with astonishing talent. That's why I gave you the goldfish vine. I knew you could grow them well." Neville brightened. He cradled the little pot of goldfish vine and stole a wary glance at Hermione, afraid the accomplished student might harm it. Hermione didn't pay it any mind and sat down in the compartment. Cher didn't either. He produced another small pot filled with rich soil from the sprout greenhouse, waved his wand, and muttered, "Terra, Laxus." The soil-loosening charm made the earth light and airy. Cher carefully planted a seed, dabbing the soil with just enough potion to keep it lightly moist. He handled every motion with the care of someone working on a delicate piece of art. When a line of text appeared on the side of the pot, "You have successfully planted goldfish vine. You may receive rewards," Cher finally relaxed into a smile. He handed the pot to Neville with obvious tenderness. "Neville, this little life is entrusted to you." Neville's face went serious. "Okay, cousin, but I don't actually know how to grow them. How often do I water them? Do they need sunlight?" Before Cher could answer, Miss Granger, already tagged the know-it-all by the others, sprang up with the standard guidance memorized from 1,000 Magical Herbs and Fungi. Goldfish vines like bright light. 5 to 6 hours a day is ideal, but don't let them bake in the midday sun in summer. They like moisture, but hate waterlogged roots. The soil should be moist but not soggy, specifically. Her constant stream of specifics quickly left Neville's expression sliding from earnest to bewildered. Cher glanced at him. "Neville, do you remember any of that?" Neville blinked. "I remembered. 50%? And now, 30%. After a beat, he admitted, "Cousin, I forgot everything." He looked crushed. "My memory's terrible. Gran won't even let me water her flowers. I can't grow plants at all. Maybe I should give these goldfish vines back to you. I'll kill them." Chari beamed. His attention was on the pots. The new seed had already pushed a slender green sprout through the soil. The earlier pots were growing greener by the minute. The tiny goldfish-shaped leaves were beginning to swell. He patted Neville's shoulder. "No, Neville, forget Miss Granger's lecture. Only mediocre people need to memorize all that stuff. You, my cousin, are a genius, a real genius. You just need to care about them. The rest, the goldfish vines will handle. I trust you completely. I'll plant more later and entrust all of them to you." Hearing such faith, Neville's face lit up. He had spent years being scolded by Gran, teased by relatives, even suspected of being a squib. He'd been pushed into awkward lessons to try to make magic happen. Timidity had been the inevitable result, but now someone believed in him, had given him responsibility and trust. Neville straightened with resolve. He would study herbology and help these plants thrive. He wouldn't let Chair down. A harsh laugh cut through the compartment. "What did I hear? I must have misheard. Neville Longbottom a genius? Merlin, then Hogwarts would be full of Dumbledores." The door swung open. A pale, pointed-faced boy with platinum hair pushed in, flanked by two hulking cronies. Chair recognized them immediately, Draco Malfoy and his henchmen, Crabbe and Goyle. Chair remembered the way Draco had been idolized in the films, but anyone who'd read the books knew the truth. He was insufferable. Neville flushed as the taunts hit home. His throat tightened, and he couldn't reply. Hermione's face tightened with anger. "Eavesdropping on people's conversations is rude, whoever you are." Malfoy's sneer deepened. From Hermione's manner, he guessed she was Muggle-born. "A Muggle-born, is it? You probably don't know what the name Malfoy means." He turned his haughty gaze on Chair and Neville. "Neville Longbottom, the boy who was nearly a squib, and your cousin, Sprout's latest import from the Muggle world. I hear your talents about the same. The three of you together. What a match. I don't know how Hogwarts lets people like you in." Cherry's face remained expressionless. "Oh, is your father planning to become headmaster and sent you on a reconnaissance mission? Is he going to expel Muggleborns when he takes office? Dismiss wizards from the magical world with poor talent? Will Hogwarts become an elitist school under Malfoy rule? I'll ask my aunt about it and have her speak to Professor Dumbledore." Malfoy's smugness froze. Even at that age, he knew when to bite back. He snorted, turned, and strode to leave. Chair moved to close the compartment door, but Crabbe's eye had landed on Neville's pot. The rich green plant, its tiny goldfish-shaped leaves, made Crabbe think of chocolate frogs. "What is that?" he asked. "Did the Chocolate Frog Company make a new flavor? Matcha?" He licked his lips and reached for the pot. "Let me taste it." 12. Beat up Malfoy, the devil parasite grass. As Crabbe reached for the goldfish vine, Malfoy's footsteps stalled. Amusement curled the corner of his mouth. Goyle licked his lips. Suddenly, Crabbe's prize did look like a treat, green and goldfish-shaped, like a chocolate frog. It might burst with juice at a bite. "I want some too," Goyle said, grabbing Crabbe's sleeve. "Give me a bite," he demanded. Crabbe and Goyle barely registered Charles, Neville, and Hermione. Hadn't Malfoy said squibs and Muggleborns were inferior? Hermione was just a witch from the Muggle world, and none of them had learned spells yet. Size was truth in their eyes. Hermione's face drained of color. "How rude. Arrogant," she added, and drew her wand. She'd practiced a few small charms at home and could manage the basics, but standing opposite Crabbe and Goyle, two hulking boys, her hand trembled. Her heart pounded. Would her little charms do anything against them? Neville couldn't cast at all, but he planted himself between the vine and the bullies, eyes hard. That plant had been given to him by his cousin Charles. Even if he got beaten, he wouldn't let them take it. The compartment crackled with tension. Then came the soft click of a lock. Malfoy froze. He hadn't expected the door to be shut. Charles had quietly locked it from the inside. Malfoy's smug look faltered. A coldness spread through the compartment. Charles' expression hardened. His fists tightened. "You came here sneering at squibs and Muggleborns," he said quietly. "I won't argue with you, but you came to eat the goldfish vine I planted?" Something in his voice snapped. Memories flashed over him. A dark, windy night, the experimental field he'd left for only half an hour, women who had come and ruined the tangerines he'd tended. "Why are your tangerines so sour?" one had scoffed. "They won't sell," another had said. The faces blurred into Crabbe and Goyle. Anger rose in him like a tide. Then Charles moved. His fists blurred. He struck Crabbe and Goyle hard. The two boys, each taller than Charles by more than a head, hit the floor. Charles followed with stomps and shouted like a man venting years of fury. "You'll eat tangerines. Eat them and complain they're sour. My thesis, my graduation. eat, and still complain. Malfoy, watching the onslaught, turned pale. When Charles' eyes locked on him, he babbled, I didn't eat. I wouldn't. That thing looks awful. And then with a sickening thud, his vision went dark. He clutched his head and collapsed. Charles seized him by the collar. Are my plants for you to criticize? He spat. Are you studying agriculture, or am I? He threw Malfoy to the floor and exhaled slowly. Phew, that felt good. Neville and Hermione shivered. So that was why he'd locked the door, to beat up Malfoy and his cronies. Terrifying. Malfoy's cries rose into the compartment, full of hatred. I'll have my father get you all expelled, all of you. He wept. Charles' mouth twisted. From his pocket, he produced 3 dark, lumpy seeds and jammed them into the Malfoy trio's mouths. Malfoy's eyes widened with terror. What are you making me eat? He stammered. Charles looked almost pitying. Devil parasite grass seeds, he said. You heard of it? Malfoy, who detested herbology, gaped blankly. Charles went on, voice low and precise. Devil parasite grass is a rare and dangerous dark arts plant. Not even 1,000 magical herbs and fungi mentions it. Only the sprout family knows about it. It's highly toxic, but the worst part is how it grows. It has to take root inside a human body, and the nutrients it needs come from the flesh and blood of the host. Young wizards like you are its favorite. The compartment fell deathly silent. You'll start to feel strange, but you won't know why, Charles continued. That's the grass sprouting inside you, its shoots drinking your blood. When it's mature, it will pop, burst out of your chest. He hadn't finished before Malfoy's face crumpled in absolute terror, and he fainted. Charles sneered, so timid and yet so full of himself. Then he hauled the 3 boys out of the compartment and unceremoniously tossed them into the corridor. When he turned back, Hermione and Neville were white and shaking. Hermione's expression mixed fear and outrage. Charles, what you did was wrong, she said, voice trembling but loud. Even if they were awful, you can't use something like that. You could get arrested. Charles paused, then laughed. You really thought the devil parasite grass was real? Hermione and Neville stared at him. Charles held out a handful of small black seeds. These are just ordinary watermelon seeds from the Muggle world. I roasted them as a snack. Want some? When Char told them that what he'd fed Malfoy and the others wasn't Devil's Snare at all, but ordinary watermelon seeds, Hermione and Neville finally let out a relieved breath. The whole compartment burst into cheerful laughter. Hermione laughed until her sides ached. Look how frightened Malfoy was. If he knew what really scared him, someone added, he'd want to crawl into a hole. The whistle of the Hogwarts Express blew. With a rumble, they left King's Cross, sped past suburbs, and then out over the open countryside. Outside the compartment, a vendor's hawking voice floated down the corridor. Chocolate frogs, licorice wands, every flavor beans. Char had the odd impression he was hearing vendors from home instead. Beer, soft drinks, mineral water, peanuts, melon seeds, even 8 treasure porridge. But Neville suddenly let out a sharp cry. He had just remembered something he'd forgotten since boarding. Trevor, his pet toad, was gone. Trevor? Neville called, peering under seats and through the baggage racks. Where did you go? After searching the entire compartment without success, Neville's voice trembled. My pet toad's gone. Don't worry, Hermione volunteered at once. It must still be on the train. A toad on a train would be memorable. Someone will have seen it. If anyone has seen it, they'll remember, Char said. I'll stay here. Some toads find their way back. Neville hesitated. But what if? What if Malfoy and his friends come back and run into Trevor? Hermione supplied, all but whispering the image. Crabbe and Goyle swallowing Trevor whole. Both of them shuddered at the thought. Char shrugged. Someone needs to be here. If it's found and taken, we can handle it. Go, check the compartments. Hermione and Neville exchanged grateful looks. Hermione grabbed Neville's sleeve, and they were gone. Char watched them hurry down the corridor, a small, inexplicable smile on his face. Fate's wheels were still turning. Hermione would probably meet Harry and Ron, just like in the original story. If Char had gone along, he might have become friends with the famous boy who lived, but he had no desire for that. Making friends with Harry Potter wouldn't help him plant trees. It might even bring him under Dumbledore's notice. Char wanted only to plant and tend magical plants quietly, and nothing about fame or childish adventure appealed to him. He took that moment to pull out a couple of small pots and carefully plant goldfish vine. These magical seedlings were vital if he wanted to grow other, more useful plants early. He treated them with particular care. Time slipped by. One moment the noon light filled the carriage, the next the window reflected the deep red of sunset and the sky went dark. Char sighed. Has it been that long? Not there yet? He muttered to himself, half joking, half wishing for a Hogwarts high-speed rail. He pushed the thought aside and watched the evening sky for a while, feeling steadier each minute. Planting trees. Planting trees. Keep planting trees. He barely noticed until shouts echoed in the corridor. 10 minutes to arrival. Char glanced out into the night, secured the 2 pots of goldfish vine on his lap, and tucked them away. Neville burst back into the compartment, out of breath and crestfallen. He hadn't found Trevor. Don't worry, Neville, Char said. It'll turn up. It couldn't get far. Hermione came back behind him, also a little winded, but the group was united. They only had a few minutes before arrival. We have to change into our school robes now, Hermione cried, panic in her voice. You have 3 minutes. Hurry up and change. Lock the compartment. I need to change. Char and Neville exchanged a look and then scrambled. The whistle blew again and the express slowed, pulling into a dark station surrounded by trees. Students filed out in orderly fashion. Hagrid stood on the platform with his lantern, booming out a welcome to the new arrivals. Older students were directed along a different route. Professor Sprout, however, threaded through the crowd and came straight to Char. Her face was bright with excitement. Char, she said, follow Hagrid. You'll go by the same route the 4 founders took with the first students. She gestured toward the boats bobbing at the water's edge. You'll receive Hogwarts' blessing as you follow that path, protection for your studies and warding from many dangers. Char felt something click into place. He'd wondered why first years still took the long boat trip when older students could apparently walk a nearer path. Now he understood. The boat route was more than ceremony. It traced the founders' route and held their blessing magic. Hogwarts' protections were simpler than some wards he'd expected, but effective. Over the years, aside from a few extraordinary incidents, students didn't die at Hogwarts. Moaning Myrtle's story was one exception. In the second year, several students survived an encounter with the basilisk. Cedric Diggory had been killed under very particular circumstances, facing Voldemort himself, and possibly transported out of Hogwarts' protective range by a portkey during the Triwizard Tournament. Barring such exceptional events, Hogwarts as a place offered a great deal of safety. That thought eased Char. It was good to know the castle wasn't a constant danger. As Char was about to step away with Sprout, Hermione, who had come close again, gathered her courage and addressed the professor. Professor, she said, I've heard there's a sorting ceremony when we get in, but none of the books describe what actually happens. They say it's a Hogwarts. May I ask, what will happen? 14. Common Enemy, Sorting Ceremony. When Hermione started firing questions, the other first years watched with a mix of anticipation and unease. Even the local children from the British wizarding world looked on. They'd been warned about Hogwarts in vague, sometimes horrifying ways. Ron Weasley, for instance, had been told by his older twin brothers that he might have to fight a troll or a werewolf during the sorting ceremony. Will there be a test to see how much magic we know? Hermione asked. I've already finished Hogwarts, a history. I've read parts of a history of magic and some common charms, but I didn't have time to study Transfiguration properly. Professor, will I have a chance to pass the sorting like this? Her rapid-fire questions fell over the group like a volley. A few of the youngsters stared as if a prodigy were showing off. Others turned pale. Many had not so much as waved a wand yet. Professor Sprout watched the gathering alarm with a faint, knowing smile. Revealing the exact proceedings of the sorting was impossible. It was a time-honored Hogwarts tradition she couldn't break. Still, she teased the answer. That, of course, is a very, very, very difficult test, she said, dragging the words out for effect. Gasps echoed around her. Then her gaze found Shia. He showed no trace of worry, which disappointed her privately. She'd hoped to see how the usually composed child would look when truly rattled. Sprout softened into a kind smile and spoke loudly to all the nervous faces. But there's nothing to worry about. No matter where you come from, no matter your background, rich or poor, when you receive a Hogwarts letter, you become part of Hogwarts. Whether you're brave or timid, Hogwarts is waiting for you. Hogwarts never gives up on any student. At last, the tension eased. Sprout winked at Ciel. See you at the sorting ceremony. With that, she turned and vanished down another path. Hagrid shepherded the group onward. Hermione, a creature of preparation, kept murmuring passages from History of Magic even as they walked, oblivious to the odd looks she drew. Ja sighed and interrupted her. Hermione. She nearly stumbled, looked up, and blinked. Hmm? You could go to any house at Hogwarts if you want to. Ciel said calmly. All 4 houses are part of the same school. None is superior. They just focus on different things. What really determines your success is your own effort and what history brings. So stop reciting History of Magic right now, or you'll miss the first sight of Hogwarts. Hermione finally shut her book and looked around, a little embarrassed but relieved. They continued in the cool night, slipping down a narrow, steep path Hagrid led them along. Turn this corner, Hagrid rumbled, and you'll see Hogwarts for the first time. They rounded the bend, and in one breathless chorus, the students cried out. The Black Lake and the castle rose before them, lit against the sky. Even Ciel felt a small thrill. This was truly where a life in magic began. Hagrid hustled them to a fleet of small boats. Ciel, Hermione, and Neville climbed into one that still had an empty seat. A small girl took that last spot. Hello, I'm Susan Bones, she offered. Ciel and Neville straightened. Hello, I'm Ciel Sprout, he said. I'm Neville Longbottom. Susan's face lit up. It's you two. My aunt and uncle spoke about you. Our families were comrades. There was a pause. Sorry, I shouldn't be talking about that now. Ciel and Neville waved her off. The Bones family had been celebrated for courage. Susan's parents had fallen fighting Voldemort, so the Boneses, the Sprouts, and the Longbottoms shared a close bond. Ciel felt warmth toward Susan, but a darker memory intruded. He knew that in the original timeline, in 1995, a Death Eater escaped from Azkaban and slaughtered members of the Bones family, Susan's uncle, aunt, and cousins. Some students at Hogwarts had even sneered and spread gossip, and Susan eventually disappeared from the public magical world. Ciel couldn't bring himself to voice events so far ahead. He didn't want to shock anyone, but he couldn't ignore the name that rose in his mind, Anton Dolohov. The original books never explicitly named the killer of the Bones family, but Dolohov was the sort of executioner-minded Death Eater capable of such brutality. He'd given the Bones trouble in battle before. If he escaped, wiping them out wouldn't be out of character. A cold flicker passed through Ciel's eyes. 1995, he thought, just over 4 years. He could choose to ignore other events, but not this. Dolohov had to die. Yet with his current strength, confronting Dolohov would be suicide. He needed to grow stronger, plant the trees, so to speak, before he could act. With that pragmatic resolve, Ciel pushed down the murderous impulse and breathed evenly. Soon they reached Hogwarts. Under Professor McGonagall's orders, the first years straightened their robes and entered the Great Hall, where the Sorting Hat sang its old song. Professor McGonagall raised her voice and called the first name. Hannah Abbott! 15. My Aunt Dean. When Professor McGonagall called out Hannah Abbott, Ciel watched the little girl, stunned for a moment, then stumbling toward the Sorting Hat. A quiet sigh rose in his chest. The Sorting Hat had returned to its loyal Hogwarts. The sorting ceremony had officially begun. He wondered which house he would be placed in. A small, knowing smile curved Ciel's lips. Of course he had an idea. The Sprout family had always had a tradition of producing Hufflepuffs. His aunt, Professor Pomona Sprout, was the head of Hufflepuff, so it would be odd if he wasn't sorted there. Ciel had no obsession with Gryffindor or Slytherin, nor did he think Ravenclaw was inherently superior. Having attended university in his previous life, he knew the school was secondary to the field of study. Herbology was Hufflepuff's strength. 8 out of 10 herbology masters in the British magical world came from Hufflepuff, and the best greenhouse in the whole magical world was run by Hufflepuff, directly overseen by his aunt. Those facts were enough. Even if the Sorting Hat offered him a different house, Ciel wouldn't entertain it. So while other Hufflepuffs fidgeted and fretted, Ciel stayed calm. He even had time to plant goldfish vine in several small pots while watching the ceremony. When Hannah Abbott barely touched the edge of the sorting hat, it immediately announced, "Hufflepuff." Applause erupted at the Hufflepuff table. After Hannah walked down with the hat still on, a ripple of laughter went through the hall. Neville, sitting beside Shia whispered, "I think I saw a kindred spirit." Shia expression flickered. More than a kindred spirit. Given the original timeline, Neville would later end up with Hannah Abbott. Some fates seemed set from the start. Watching Hannah's retreating figure, Shia felt a warm surge of interest. Not because he wanted to steal Neville's future wife, but because Hannah probably knew how to grow goldfish vine too. She and Neville would be like a pair of complementary gardeners, pillars of goldfish vine cultivation. Hufflepuffs, in general, seemed perfectly suited to tending such plants, perhaps even a bit absent-minded, but excellent gardeners all the same. The thought sent his heart racing. Too many gardeners, not enough goldfish vine. He needed to plant more. He set pot after pot, concentrating. Lines of system-like text flickered before his eyes. "You have successfully planted goldfish vine." Reward: extremely slight increase in magic perception ability in gestation. Seeing the prompts made him work faster. The other Hufflepuffs at the table had no time to notice his busyness. They were too anxious about the sorting. The faculty, however, had a clear view. Guessing which house an individual would be placed in was one of the quiet entertainments of the staff during the sorting ceremony. Watching the nervous faces of first years brought a little youthful vitality to professors who had taught at Hogwarts for years. So when they saw Shia bent over his plants, not even looking up, they were surprised. In all his years watching sortings, no one could recall a Hufflepuff so calm. "Is that a sprout?" one professor murmured. "What's he planting over there? He isn't even watching the sorting?" Professor Sprout herself sat up straighter. "That's our sprout cub," she said, watching him with unmistakable pride. "He will become the greatest herbology master in history." Pomona Sprout, usually modest, spoke boldly, so boldly that the other professors politely humored her. Even the caustic Snape, who owed her favors, refrained from his usual barbs. Dumbledore looked at her with amusement. "You've been talking for a while," Dumbledore said with his gentle smile. "Am I making you thirsty?" someone teased. Professor Sprout chuckled. "Not thirsty at all," she replied, enthusiastic. "My Shia can work for hours in a stuffy greenhouse without eating or drinking. That perseverance, that focus," Snape interrupted with a clipped "Pomona." "You weren't this talkative before," Dumbledore remarked. "If you had a child," Pomona said, smiling, "you would be like this too." She stopped mid-sentence. A strange silence fell over the staff table. Snape's face darkened like the bottom of a pot. Dumbledore's cheerful smile faded. Most of the professors at Hogwarts were indeed without families or children, and Pomona's slip was painfully pointed. She realized it immediately and apologized profusely. Fortunately for her, a murmur swept the great hall as the next name was called. Professor McGonagall's voice resumed. "Harry Potter!" Shia lifted his head and looked at the thin boy who now had the world's attention. Harry matched the image Shia remembered from the stories, so he expected the sorting to go the same way. Neville had already been sorted into Gryffindor earlier. Hermione was Gryffindor. Susan Bones had been Hufflepuff. The slight changes Shia had made weren't enough to alter the overall ceremony. After a long silence, the sorting hat announced, "Gryffindor." The roof of the great hall might as well have been lifted by the applause. The Gryffindor table erupted. Other houses offered a mix of claps, sighs, and murmured comments. Even with McGonagall signaling for quiet, everyone's attention remained on Harry. The next Hufflepuff about to be called would have big shoes to fill in that atmosphere. The next name was Shia. Professor Sprout's face went taut with nervous pride. She looked more anxious than Shia. He, however, smiled calmly, walked to the stool, and put the tattered hat on his head. Immediately, a curious voice echoed in his mind. "Oh, Hufflepuff, you are the calmest first year I've seen in all my years of sorting. You know, no matter how composed other Hufflepuffs look, they're usually anxious inside, worried about which house they'll be placed in, worried about whether they'll succeed in the future. You don't seem to have such worries. How do you do it?" Shia answered seriously in his mind. "Mainly, I believe you reap what you sow." More importantly, I have an aunt who is head of Hufflepuff and a herbology master. The Sorting Hat hesitated, almost at a loss for words. Czar's argument had been surprisingly persuasive. After a pause, it sighed, "All right then, Hufflepuff." The faculty table burst into applause. Professor Sprout leaped to her feet, clapping with obvious delight, and the Hufflepuff table answered with even warmer cheers. Even students at the other houses' tables were applauding more energetically than usual. Sprout was that well liked. Czar smiled as he met the professor's tearful eyes. Her popularity had certainly worked to his advantage. He made his way to the Hufflepuff table. Susan Bones waved him over, indicating the empty chair to her right. "Czar, sit here," Czar waved back. He would rather sit with Susan than with strangers. More importantly, the girl to his right was Hannah Abbott, still flushed from the sorting, apparently shaken by the whole ceremony. Just by being near her, the goldfish vines Czar had planted a moment before seemed to grow greener and more vigorous, as if they'd been given a tonic. His eyes brightened. Excellent. Another talent, he thought, and before Hannah could process what was happening, he set 2 small pots of goldfish vine in front of her. "Are you nervous?" Hannah blinked. Czar smiled. "This is goldfish vine. It's a magical herb. Holding it helps ease tension." She took them gratefully. "Thank you. I think I really need it." Her cheeks reddened again and she hesitated. Sorry. What was your name again?" "I was trying to remember everyone's names earlier, and I forgot them." Czar's face lit up. "No problem. Forgetting at first is normal. We're all meeting for the first time. You'll remember soon." Hannah's relief was visible as she clutched the tiny pots. Whether by placebo or magic, her breathing slowed, her nervousness eased. Above the newly planted goldfish vine, a cluster of faintly glowing lights, some kind of reward effect, kept expanding, and Czar watched it with satisfaction. On his left, Susan leaned closer. "Czar, these are called goldfish." "What? Goldfish what? Do you have more? I don't think I've recovered yet either." Czar grinned and handed her another pot. Susan let out a surprised sigh. "It really works. My heart rate has gone down." Hufflepuffs nearby glanced at Czar with shy, hopeful looks. He began distributing the rest of the potted goldfish vines he had brought, and soon most of the first years at the Hufflepuff table had one. "It was actually arranged by my aunt, Professor Sprout, our Hufflepuff head," Czar explained to the curious faces. "Consider it a sorting gift from the dean. Our house is strong in herbology. She hopes these goldfish vines grow with you. Please accept them." Hufflepuffs relaxed. A gift from the dean. How rude would it be to refuse? Smiles spread as each first year accepted a tiny plant. Who said Hufflepuff was dull? This house was wonderful. The sense of belonging at the Hufflepuff table climbed sharply. Across the room, the other professors watched the scene with surprise. "Pomona, why are you handing out presents?" someone asked. "Goldfish vines for the Hufflepuffs. How fitting," Sprout beamed. "It must be our Czar. That child is so thoughtful, planting goldfish vines to give to his classmates." Just as she warmed to another proud speech, Dumbledore cut in gently. "Pomona, the sorting ceremony is nearly over. Let us prepare for the next part." The interruption saved the rest of the staff from a longer eulogy. Dumbledore watched the Hufflepuff activity, and the more he saw Czar sharing plants so effortlessly, the more small niggling doubts surfaced in his mind. Was Czar unusually adept at reading people? Was there some manipulation? Then he dismissed the worry. Czar was a Hufflepuff, surely without ill intent. His talent was remarkable, yes, but that made him all the more harmless. Just a bright Hufflepuff, nothing more. Dumbledore turned his attention back to Harry, resolving to guide him so he would not follow in Tom Riddle's footsteps. His gaze flicked once to Professor Quirrell, then toward the remaining undecided students. Only a few first years were left. Ron Weasley, eventually sorted into Gryffindor, nearly fainted when the hat made its choice, just as happened in tales told of previous years. Czar felt a peculiar little thrill seeing Harry, Hermione, and Ron seated together in Gryffindor, the trio who, in legend, would later challenge Voldemort. But Czar set that aside quickly. He'd watch history if he wanted, but right now he preferred planting a few more things and turning a tidy profit. When the last students had been placed, Dumbledore, eyes twinkling, cried the same words the school had heard before. "Nitwit, blubber, oddment, tweak." At the Ravenclaw table, older students explained the odd exclamation to the new eaglets. each house thinking the others fit one of those words best. The Hufflepuff table listened in bemused silence, then shrugged and dove into dinner. Czar watched the Hufflepuffs tucking into food while their goldfish vines on the table greedily sucked up nutrients. He smiled broadly. Talents, real talent, were everywhere here. He had made the right choice coming to Hufflepuff. During the feast, the other long tables were noisy and alive. The Ravenclaw first years argued about favorite books and which branches of magic fascinated them. The Slytherins were busy setting rules. Slytherin had always been strictly hierarchical, with status assigned from the moment of enrollment according to bloodline and family ties. Purebloods grew up understanding that. Those who hadn't belonged to that circle before were reminded of it now. The Gryffindors, predictably, talked about everything under the sun. Harry was explaining his family situation to Neville and Ron. Hermione was quizzing Percy, the prefect, about transfiguration. Laughter and arguments carried across those tables. Hufflepuff's long table was the exception. The Hufflepuffs ate quietly, heads bent over their plates. The older students comforted the new ones in a chorus of practical advice. Don't eat too fast, you'll spoil your appetite. We have our own little kitchen, you know. At any hour, you can find something delicious in Hufflepuff, much better than this banquet. Save room for the late-night snacks. The first years almost cried with joy. This life sounded unbearably comfortable. As far as they were concerned, Dumbledore's stern warning after the feast, don't go into the Forbidden Forest, don't wander the fourth-floor corridor, meant nothing. Adventure hadn't crossed their minds. Why leave the common room, sit by the fire with tea and a snack, and waste the evening wandering corridors? Chard felt the same contentment settling over him. In Gryffindor or Slytherin, taking up planting or a quiet hobby might make someone stand out, invite scrutiny. In Hufflepuff, however, everyone happily stayed indoors. Planting flowers and herbs, practicing tea ceremonies, baking, anything that could be done at home was ordinary here. Planting trees in Hufflepuff wouldn't raise an eyebrow. The sorting ceremony finally ended with the school song, and prefects led the new students back to their dormitories, every house except Hufflepuff. As the older Hufflepuffs had promised, there was a second, smaller feast in the Hufflepuff common room. After everyone had eaten their fill, the first years were shown to soft beds and fell asleep almost at once. Hufflepuff felt like the most comfortable house in Hogwarts. The best little kitchen, the coziest beds, the happiest atmosphere, united in the way only Hufflepuff could be. Chard lay on his bed for a long moment, as if the whole thing might still be a dream. Then he sat up. It still feels unreal, he thought, and decided the best cure was to plant something. Just a few pots to calm down. You have successfully planted a goldfish vine. You have successfully planted a goldfish vine. You have successfully planted a goldfish vine. Line after line of prompts appeared over the pots. As he planted, Chard's thoughts grew clearer. Being in Hufflepuff would help him avoid some of the conflicts from the old story, the Gryffindor-Slytherin fights, the secret machinations between Dumbledore and Voldemort. But the Great War from that timeline would still come someday. Even Hufflepuff would find peace hard to keep. And there were other, more specific dangers. In a few years, Anton Dolohov might escape Azkaban. Even if he didn't do anything else, Dolohov had to be killed. Chard knew that would be nearly impossible with his existing talent. Dolohov was an opponent who gave most Aurors trouble, but with the planting system's help, it might become possible. I need to plant as many of the right things as I can, he decided, especially magical plants that yield rare rewards. To grow high-difficulty plants, I need a strong magic perception. Goldfish vines were crucial to that plan. Chard worked out the numbers in his head. So far, I've given away 22 pots of goldfish vine to Neville and the other Hufflepuffs. He rummaged in his bag. 18 seeds remained. Planting all of these should be enough for now. I'll place them on the confusing staircases. Hogwarts had 142 staircases, many of them governed by odd rules. Even older students still got lost. If I put them where people often take the wrong stairs, the vines will absorb some nutrients from the bustle. He thought about asking his aunt for more seeds, but the supply of the required memory charm was limited. Without enough memory charm, the goldfish vine will be high maintenance and hard to bring to full strength. 40 pots total, with enough memory charm, should mature quickly. That'll do. 5 days passed after the sorting ceremony. The new students were settling into life at Hogwarts, and talent differences had already begun to show. Hermione Granger was, as everyone expected, remarkable. Her transfiguration work made Professor McGonagall smile, rare and approving. Ravenclaws shone in charms. Overall, the professors, most of whom were competent and perceptive, were already forming opinions about aptitudes. Over Friday breakfast, they spoke quietly among themselves. "What do you think of this year's students?" someone asked. "Hermione is very talented. Apart from not having the most powerful raw magic, she has almost no flaws. Harry's not cut out for astronomy. He lacks the patience. He needs polishing in transfiguration and charms, but his magical strength is undeniably high. With that, he'll pick up powerful spells sooner." Potions today. Lily's skill in potions was exceptional, so Harry should do well there. They sighed and turned to some of the students who worried them. Neville Longbottom, poor boy, too scatterbrained. Not entirely his fault. We know he suffered a memory charm to block something painful. He may show his potential in time. And be careful with Seamus in Gryffindor. He has a peculiar knack for making spells blow up. Of course, the conversation touched on Chard. McGonagall and Flitwick were both regretful. "A very clever child," McGonagall said. "He understands quickly and concentrates well. If only his magical talent were even average, if it were a little stronger, he could do great things," Flitwick added. "It's such a pity." Professor Sprout arrived at the faculty table then, expression blank at first, then hardening. She had been watching Chard even more closely than the others. "I will not let weak magic be the limit for Chard," she said, clenching her fists. "No matter how difficult, I will gather the materials and brew a talent enhancement potion." Her determination was absolute. Chard, however, had not come down for breakfast. He had no idea he was the subject of their sympathy. Truthfully, he didn't care much. Low magic strength was temporary. Once the batch of Margarets in the Sprout family greenhouse matured and he harvested the rewards, things would improve. 4 months remained. He could wait. Right now, his priority was cultivating goldfish vines. He stood by one of Hogwarts' most confusing staircases, a major crossroads and the only way to the potions classroom, and waited for traffic. Soon Neville came barreling toward him, panicked. "I'm going to be late! I'm going to be late!" Neville gasped. "If I'm late for potions, it'll be a disaster." Oh no, which staircase was it again? Chard felt something like triumph. 3 lights shimmered above Neville's pocket and prompts blinked into view. "The goldfish vine you planted has matured. Reward obtainable. Slight increase in magic perception." 18. Magical perception enhancement. Fluorescent spell thrice. Seeing the notification lines, Ciel took a deep breath. As expected of Neville, around him the goldfish vines were practically on steroids. In just 5 days, 3 pots had reached maturity. Judging by the size of the light clusters, they were in perfect condition. Neville noticed Ciel and looked like he'd found a savior. "Cousin, which staircase goes to the potions classroom?" "I forgot again." Ciel smiled and pointed to the staircase on his right. Neville's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you, Cousin Ciel." As Neville started up the stairs, Ciel remembered something from the original story. Neville's first potions lesson had been a disaster. He'd brewed the boil-curing potion wrong, spilled it on himself, broken out in painful boils, and been hauled off to the medical wing by an enraged Snape. From then on, Neville had been terrified of potions and would even tremble at the sight of Snape. Out of family concern and gratitude for Neville's help with the goldfish vines, Ciel felt compelled to warn him. "Neville, the first potions class is simple," he called. "It's just the boil-curing potion. You can do it. Just remember one thing. When you add the porcupine quills, take the cauldron off the fire. Don't forget that." Neville inhaled deeply and repeated the line over and over, as if memorizing a life-saving mantra. His tension eased noticeably. He thanked Ciel again and hurried off. Ciel watched his retreating back, not expecting Neville to become a potions prodigy, but at least hoping he wouldn't end up in the medical wing. Ciel's attention turned to the 3 reward light clusters drifting toward him. "This is the reward for planting goldfish vine. Slightly enhanced magic perception?" he guessed, eyes bright with anticipation. He reached out and touched them. The clusters merged into him, and a strange sensation flowed through his veins, faint but definite, as if a dormant sense had been activated and would respond when called on. Before he could fully process it, the sensation faded and a new entry appeared in his system panel's abilities section. Magic Perception Enhancement. Ciel wasn't surprised. 3 perfectly matured goldfish vines should yield a decent reward, and bronze tier was reasonable. He already had some magic perception, so the enhancement produced subtle but real differences. When he cast his soil loosening spell, a spell he'd practiced nearly every day for the past 2 months, it felt smoother and more fluid, and the effect was slightly stronger. He nodded in satisfaction. It wasn't dramatic, but the improvement was there. If the remaining goldfish vines matured and he stacked more rewards, the enhancement might reach silver tier, giving him more obvious gains. Unfortunately, aside from Neville, no one else could make the vines mature that quickly. The rest would probably take about 3 more weeks. That wasn't too long. By then, he might be ready to plant more demanding magical herbs. He headed to his next class. Compared to the potions drama that would play out between Gryffindor and Slytherin in the original timeline, Hufflepuff's schedule was straightforward, a routine charms lesson. This was the second charms class of the week, and the students were eager. The first class had been mostly theory, the history, significance, and development of charms, and ended with Professor Flitwick briefly demonstrating a lumos. There hadn't been time to practice then, and only a few exceptionally bright Ravenclaws who'd prepared in advance had managed to produce the spell. The Hufflepuffs had been left empty-handed, so in today's class everyone expected practice. When the bell rang, Professor Flitwick, cheerfully animated as ever, said, "Last Monday we spent most of our time discussing the status, significance, and development of charms. At the very end, I showed you Lumos briefly. Today we will spend the entire period practicing. Don't be bored, okay?" The Ravenclaws, often called the Eaglets, brightened, and so did the Hufflepuffs. Flitwick demonstrated Lumos again. Lumos is a simple charm, but it requires coordination between your wand movement and the incantation. The most important thing is concentration. If you're not careful, you might set your wand on fire, or break it at the start of term, which would be troublesome. He flicked his wand elegantly. Lumos, a steady, soft light blossomed from its tip. Even though they'd seen it before, the students still murmured in admiration. "Let's practice," he encouraged. "Boys and girls." Wands were whipped out the instant he said it. The difference between Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff became clear almost immediately. A Ravenclaw student rotated his wand smoothly and spoke the incantation. A ball of light formed, still flickering, but unmistakably a successful lumos. "Very good," Flitwick praised. "I see you reviewed after the last class. 1 point for Ravenclaw." Within 10 minutes, most Ravenclaws could produce lumos reliably. Flitwick was inwardly pleased with them. When he looked to the Hufflepuffs, however, he felt a different emotion. Since he hadn't given homework, the Hufflepuffs hadn't practiced. They continued to fumble through wrist movements and mangled the words. "Lumos, Rumos, Lumax," Flitwick patiently corrected each mistake. Ciel watched the Ravenclaws and the unstable light at the tips of their wands. A thoughtful expression crossed his face. "Their Lumos works, but it's unstable," he thought. "The magic output isn't smooth enough. I didn't notice this in the last class. Could this be the magic perception enhancement at work?" Professor Flitwick strolled over to him with a friendly smile. "Come along, Mr. Ciel. Don't be shy. Show me your Lumos." Ciel nodded, flicked his wrist, rotated his wand, and said clearly, "Lumos, 19 fluorescent improvements, exclusive spells." As the class recited the standard incantation, Shire concentrated on keeping his magical output steady. A small, steady light blossomed at the tip of his ashwood wand. It wasn't dazzling, but it was remarkably stable. Professor Flitwick's face registered surprise, then broke into applause. "Beautiful Lumos." Hufflepuff gets 3 points. The Ravenclaws were stunned. Usually their best could only coax a single point out of Flitwick. After all, he was their prefect and head of house. How could he award 3 points to a Hufflepuff? They fell silent, eyes fixed on Shire's wand. Yes, the light did seem a touch stronger than their own Lumos, but the Ravenclaw's confidence returned quickly. It would take them only a little longer to catch up. The Hufflepuffs cheered for Shire. Only Flitwick watched him with a complicated expression. He'd observed Shire in the previous class. This improvement was real. Shire must have been practicing after class, and a lot of it because his control had sharpened remarkably in a short time. The boy wasn't an easy case. At the same time, Flitwick felt the familiar pang of pity. Talent was a cruel thing. Effort could only go so far. Lumos could be improved by practice, but some charms separated the naturally gifted from the rest. Take the Patronus charm, for instance, far beyond the reach of most. Even something as ostensibly simple as the shield charm was out of reach for many. A surprising number of witches and wizards never mastered it in their lives, and not even all ministry employees could deploy it reliably. Try as Shire might, there was only so much sheer practice could overcome. Still, as a teacher, Flitwick could offer encouragement. He gave a small smile and announced, "All right, 4 weeks from now, we'll hold a small Lumos test. The 4 students who show the best performance, the most progress, or the most creative insight, I'll design a little, interesting charm for each of them." The classroom erupted. Lumos was a simple spell, but what a young witch or wizard wanted most of all was a unique charm written just for them, especially if it came from the charm's master. Even the Hufflepuffs whooped. The chance to have a charm tailored by Flitwick himself was a prize few could imagine. Shire noticed that when Flitwick made the announcement, his eyes had lingered on him. He understood the implication. Flitwick was encouraging a student who had clearly been working hard. Whether it came from professional concern, a courtesy to Professor Sprout, or a desire to foster confidence, the kindness warmed him. Most of the professors at Hogwarts, he thought, were competent and decent. Only a few took pleasure in discouraging students. The reward made Shire thoughtful. A custom-made charm from a charms master wasn't common currency. Hogwarts offered opportunities that didn't exist elsewhere. He could have asked Sprout to press a favor, but that would have been using connections rather than earning something himself. The chance to win it on his own meant more. He wasn't after prestige. Flitwick's charms would likely not be world-shattering spells, but even a minor charm could be invaluable. Lumos itself was mostly used for illumination, but that light, its frequency and constancy, mattered to magical plants. Professor Sprout had taught him that some plants respond to light in unexpected ways. In his past life, he'd studied agricultural science and the effects of specific light frequencies on plant growth. Perhaps magical plants had analogous preferences. If a modified Lumos could give a precise frequency or steadier output, it might accelerate the growth of certain species, goldfish vines among them. If that worked, his magic perception would improve faster, letting him cultivate more powerful magical plants sooner. But with Shire's current level, modifying even Lumos was a stretch. With Flitwick's help, though, a subtle alteration might be doable. That possibility is what made him so intent on the upcoming test. 4 weeks. He murmured to himself. By then, the first batch of goldfish vines should be mature. His magic perception would be sharper. Casting Lumos would receive a strong boost. He didn't assume victory. Hogwarts was full of eccentric geniuses. But he had other advantages. Physical stamina, for one. Many young wizards found holding and waving a wand surprisingly tiring. Most wands were heavy enough that arms ached after repeated practice. Students had to limit their sessions. Shire felt none of that burden. Wielding a wand felt like waving thin air. As long as he didn't practice to the point of exhaustion, he could keep going. So for the rest of the lesson, he devoted himself entirely to Lumos. Time and again, he traced the incantation and flicked his wand. Lumos! Lumos! Each cast he performed with meticulous consistency. The Ravenclaws tried to match him at first. They practiced earnestly too, but soon their arms complained, and they had to stop, casting envious glances at Shire in the hope that he too would slow. He did not. He showed no soreness, no fatigue, no waning interest. He kept the motion smooth and steady, over and over. The small light at his wand tip, increased by imperceptible degrees, grew brighter and more stable. The Ravenclaws stared, one thought forming in every face. Is he not getting tired? Charm's classroom. Charles' earnest Lumos rang out, steady and true. The Hufflepuffs, watching him wave their wands, seemed encouraged. Though their arms ached, they bit their lips and kept trying. Charles had earned points for Hufflepuff. They weren't going to let him do it alone. Lumos! Luma, no, Lumos. The clumsy mispronunciations dwindled. Small pinpricks of light began to appear, one by one at the tips of wands. Those who managed it turned to help their classmates. The glow spread faster and faster until, when the bell for the end of class rang, Hannah Abbott, cheeks flushed with determination, took a deep breath and cried, Lumos. The last wand flared to life. Professor Flitwick clapped delightedly. 10 points to Hufflepuff, he announced, for your effort and unity. The Hufflepuffs beamed. The Ravenclaws, by contrast, looked unsettled. They had started the lesson with 10 points for Ravenclaw, but with Charles' gain and Hufflepuff's others, Hufflepuff now had 13, more than Ravenclaw. They'd lost. If the winners had been cleverer students, they might have swallowed it. But these Hufflepuffs, the ones everyone assumed were slow, had just outshined them. The self-styled intellectual Ravenclaws found it hard to accept. Professor Flitwick met their baffled faces with a peculiar smile. You find it strange, don't you? Among the 4 houses, Hufflepuff students are often called dull, and Ravenclaw students are called the smartest. So why did you lose? Remember, smart and dull are not always what they seem. Hufflepuff has produced brilliant individuals as often as any other house, and not simply because there are more of them. Time and again, eaglets have been outstripped by Hufflepuffs. Some Ravenclaws left chastened, others thoughtful, but hunger soon distracted them. They were still growing, and charms practice had left them famished, and they trailed off toward the Great Hall. Meanwhile, the first years from potions emerged. The Slytherins came out grinning, while the Gryffindors looked sullen. Malfoy and his cronies were still crowing about what had happened in class, mimicking Snape's cold interrogation. The famous Harry Potter, let's see what you know, Malfoy sang, making his voice thick with mockery. What happens if you add powdered asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? I don't know, sir, his companions parroted. Where do you get a bezoar? I don't know, sir. What's the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane? I don't know, sir. They howled at their own imitation of Snape's disdain. Charles sat at the Hufflepuff table, eating absently and checking on the goldfish vines he'd handed out. The clusters of reward light showed progress. Hannah Abbott's small pots were close behind Neville's in growth. In about 5 days, her plants should be ready. The rest would follow in 2 or 3 weeks. If that went as expected, Charles' magic perception enhancement might rise from bronze toward silver. The system's level readings had been reliable so far. Every jump had produced a noticeable improvement. His soil loosening spell and pruning charm had both become significantly stronger when they went from bronze to silver. If magic perception followed the same pattern, a couple of level gains would bring a real, qualitative change. He watched Malfoy's imitation and smirked inwardly. Potion questions, Snape's 3 more challenges to Harry. It followed the script. Adding powdered asphodel to wormwood doesn't only make the draught of living death, Charles thought. Put those 2 together, and it's eternal regret. Snape, he thought, couldn't help being a tsundere. Then his eyes flicked to Neville. He was pale but intact. Relief washed over Charles. Neville was his most reliable source of goldfish vine rewards, usually producing a batch every 5 days. If Neville had been sent to the hospital wing, Charles' supply would be in trouble. Malfoy noticed Neville, and the Slytherin's laughter ratcheted up. If you ask me, Harry Potter isn't the most foolish one of them taunted. Merlin above, how can Neville Longbottom be so hopeless? Watching him is comedy. They exaggerated the story of potion spills and imagined porcupine quills in cauldrons, howling at the thought of Neville breaking out in boils. Their cruel mockery echoed through the hall. At the staff table, Professor McGonagall's jaw tightened. Professor Flitwick's smile was gone. Professor Sprout looked pale. Severus, McGonagall said sharply, you must rein your students in. This is too much. You can't keep using hurtful words to mock them. Not every pupil is a potions genius. Snape, however, seemed unmoved, his expression flat with a familiar coldness. My teaching method is like this, he said, for students without talent, making them face that reality early so they do not waste effort on potions, can be a kindness. As for what they say to each other, those small frictions are best left alone. Professors not interfering in student banter is the usual practice here. After all, this is the magical world, not a fairy tale.